I learned that love could be a burden the day they wheeled Jane Doe into room 347 and left her there to die. Nobody knew her name. Nobody claimed her body. And nobody except me seemed to care that she was disappearing a little more each day. The hospital administrators called her a financial liability. The other nurses called her a lost cause. I called her mine. 3 months I'd been caring for her. 3 months of washing her frail body and changing sheets that smelled like antiseptic and slow death. 3 months of talking to someone who couldn't talk back and wondering if any part of her trapped mind could hear me. My name is Victoria Morgan. I'm 26 years old, and I make $32,000 a year trying to keep people alive in a hospital that treats patients like inventory and nurses like replaceable parts. The woman in room 347 had been found collapsed outside a warehouse in the industrial district. No identification, no wallet, no phone, nothing but expensive clothes that suggested a life very different from the one she was living now. Brain injury, the doctors said with the kind of casual dismissal that came from seeing too much tragedy. Minimal brain activity, no family coming forward, recommend comfort care only. Comfort care was hospital speak for let her die with dignity, which really meant stop wasting resources on someone who'll never wake up. But there was something about her that made me refuse to give up. Maybe it was the way her hands were still elegant despite the IV lines, or the faint scars on her knuckles that suggested a history of defending herself, or the expensive wedding ring she wore that meant someone somewhere had loved her enough to make promises. I started staying late after my shifts ended, sitting beside her bed and reading aloud from books I brought from home. I talked to her about everything and nothing, about the weather outside her window and the hospital gossip she was missing, about my own pathetic life and the dreams I'd given up to pay rent. The other nurses thought I was crazy, wasting emotional energy on a patient who'd never wake up, never thank me, never even know I existed. But crazy was better than numb, and I'd been numb for too long. My apartment was a studio in the worst part of town, the kind of place where gunshots were background noise and the locks on the doors were suggestions rather than security. I worked double shifts whenever possible, not because I loved nursing, but because poverty had taught me that survival required constant motion. Standing still meant falling behind, and falling behind meant ending up like the patients I cared for, broken and forgotten and dependent on the mercy of strangers. The woman in 347 became my project, my purpose, the thing that made the endless shifts and aching feet feel like they mattered. I brought in lotion to massage her hands, preventing the contractures that came from immobility. I played music on my phone, classical pieces that seemed to match her elegant bearing. I kept her hair brushed and her nails clean, maintaining dignity that the hospital's minimal care wouldn't provide. Sometimes I swore I saw her eyelids flutter when I spoke, or felt her fingers twitch against mine. But the doctors said it was just reflexes, meaningless movements that meant nothing about consciousness or awareness. Still, I chose to believe otherwise. Chose to believe that somewhere in the darkness of her damaged brain, she knew someone was fighting for her. The hospital administration started pressuring me to stop the extra care. "Victoria, you're setting yourself up for heartbreak," my supervisor said, with the kind of tired sympathy that came from years of watching idealistic nurses burn out. "She's not going to wake up. You need to accept that and move on." But moving on felt like abandoning her, and I'd been abandoned enough in my own life to know how that felt. My mother had left when I was 8. My father had drunk himself to death by the time I was 16, and every relationship I'd tried to build since then had crumbled under the weight of my own damage and distrust. Maybe saving this nameless woman was really about saving some part of myself I'd thought was already dead. The morning everything changed started like any other morning. I arrived at the hospital at 6, exhausted from 4 hours of sleep and another nightmare about being late for a shift I couldn't afford to miss. Room 347 was at the end of the hall, tucked away where dying patients wouldn't disturb anyone important. I pushed open the door expecting to find her exactly as I'd left her the night before, still and silent, and trapped in whatever darkness held her captive. Instead, I found chaos. 3 men in dark suits stood around her bed, and even in my exhaustion, I recognized danger when I saw it. They moved with the kind of predatory grace that suggested violence was a language they spoke fluently. The largest one had his hand resting on something concealed beneath his jacket, and his eyes tracked my entrance with the flat assessment of someone deciding whether I was a threat. The woman was still unconscious, still trapped, but something about the air in the room had changed. These men brought tension with them like other people brought flowers. "Who are you?" The question came out steadier than I felt. The men exchanged glances, some kind of silent communication I couldn't interpret. The one closest to the bed was younger than the others, maybe early 30s, with dark hair and eyes that held intelligence and calculation in equal measure. He wore his expensive suit like armor, and when he looked at the woman in the bed, something flickered across his face that might have been pain if men like him allowed themselves to feel anything. "I'm the person who's been keeping her alive," I continued, anger overriding fear. "And you're not supposed to be here. Visiting hours don't start until 8 and only family is allowed in ICU rooms." The younger man's attention shifted to me fully, and I felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing. His eyes were pale gray, unusual and unsettling, missing nothing as they catalogued every detail of my appearance. When he spoke, his voice carried an accent I couldn't place, and authority that suggested he was used to being obeyed. "You've been caring for my mother." The words hit me like cold water. Mother. This woman, who nobody claimed, who'd been listed as Jane Doe for 3 months, had a son, had family, had people who should have been here fighting for her instead of leaving her alone to die in a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and abandonment. "Where have you been?" The question exploded from me before I could think about wisdom or consequences. She's been here for 3 months. 3 months of no visitors, no phone calls, no one asking about her condition. "Where the hell have you been?" The large man with his hand under his jacket moved forward, but the younger man stopped him with a single gesture. His pale eyes never left my face, and I saw him reassessing whatever conclusions he'd drawn about me. Looking for her, his voice was quiet but carried an edge that suggested violence barely controlled. "My mother disappeared 3 months ago. No note, no warning, just gone. We've been searching every hospital, every morgue, every possible place she could be, but she was listed as Jane Doe with no identification, so we had no way of finding her." The explanation should have satisfied me, but anger had momentum, and I was too tired and too emotionally invested to stop. "She's been lying here alone," I said, my voice shaking. "The doctors wanted to pull her feeding tube 2 weeks ago. Said she was a waste of resources, that nobody was coming for her, so why bother keeping her alive?" I fought them. I stayed with her every single day, talked to her, took care of her, made sure she knew someone gave a damn whether she lived or died. And now you show up, 3 months late, and expect what exactly? The room went very quiet. The 2 larger men looked at their companion like they expected him to explode, to respond to my disrespect with the kind of violence their bearing suggested they were capable of. Instead, he did something I didn't expect. He moved closer to his mother's bed, his hand reaching out to touch her face with a gentleness that contradicted everything else about him. When he spoke again, his voice was rough with something that might have been grief or guilt or both. "Thank you," he said simply, "for keeping her alive when no one else cared enough to try." The young man's name was Daniel Rossi, And over the next hour, I learned things about my patient that transformed her from Jane Doe into someone with a history and identity that explained the expensive clothes and elegant bearing. Her real name was Delilah Rossi. She was 58 years old, and according to her son, she'd been the matriarch of one of the most powerful crime families on the East Coast. The warehouse where she'd been found belonged to a rival organization, and the working theory was that she'd been taken as leverage in some kind of territorial dispute. Something had gone wrong, she'd been injured, and whoever took her had panicked and dumped her where she'd eventually be found. Daniel told me this standing beside his mother's bed, his voice carefully controlled, but his hands trembling slightly as they held hers. I watched him process 3 months of missed time, 3 months where his mother had been alone and unprotected, dependent on the mercy of strangers in a system that hadn't wanted her. The guilt in his pale eyes was something I recognized, the particular self-torture that came from failing to protect someone you loved. "I need to move her," Daniel said, his attention shifting back to me. "Somewhere secure, with proper care and protection. She'll have round-the-clock nursing, the best doctors, whatever she needs." The statement should have been a relief. My patient would finally get the resources and attention she deserved, and I could stop carrying the weight of her survival alone. Instead, I felt something twist in my chest that might have been loss or fear, or the selfish realization that caring for Delilah had given my life meaning it otherwise lacked. "She's stable here," I heard myself say. "Moving her could be dangerous, especially if whoever hurt her is still looking for her." Daniel's pale eyes studied me with uncomfortable intensity. "You're right to be cautious, but staying here is more dangerous. If we found her, others can too. The hospital's records aren't as secure as you might think, and there are people who would very much like to finish what they started." His gaze shifted to include his mother, lying unconscious and vulnerable between us. "I won't let that happen." The certainty in his voice carried the weight of absolute authority, and I found myself believing him despite every instinct screaming that I should be terrified of this man and everything he represented. There was something about the way he looked at his mother, something raw and desperate beneath his carefully controlled exterior, that made him seem almost human. "I want to come with her." The words came out before I'd fully thought them through. Daniel's eyebrow rose slightly, the first crack in his composed expression. "That's not necessary. We'll have professional nursing staff." "She knows me," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "I've been with her every day for 3 months. I know her patterns, her vitals, what's normal and what's not. She might be unconscious, but having familiar faces and voices around her matters. Studies show that coma patients respond to familiarity, that consistency in care can impact recovery outcomes." The speech sounded more professional than I felt, and I could see Daniel weighing my words against whatever concerns he had about bringing a stranger into his world. Behind him, the two large men exchanged glances that suggested they thought their boss was crazy to even consider my request. "You understand what you're asking for?" Daniel said carefully. "My family's business isn't legal. Being associated with us, being in our home, means accepting certain realities that most people find uncomfortable. It means keeping secrets and looking the other way when things happen that your conscience might object to. It means entering a world you can't easily leave." I thought about my studio apartment with its broken locks, about the hospital that treated me like a replaceable part, about the life I'd been living that felt more like slow drowning than actual existence. Whatever darkness existed in Daniel Rossi's world, it couldn't be worse than the darkness I'd been navigating alone. Plus, someone needed to make sure Delilah got the care she deserved, and I'd spent 3 months fighting for her when no one else would. "I understand," I said, meeting his pale eyes without flinching. "And I accept whatever consequences come with that choice." The Rossi estate existed in a different reality than anything I'd experienced before. We drove for over an hour outside the city limits, the landscape transforming from urban decay to manicured wealth that felt almost aggressive in its perfection. The house that rose before us belonged in architectural magazines, all stone and glass and careful design that suggested power without ostentation. Security was everywhere, cameras hidden in strategic positions, guards who tried to look like gardeners and maintenance workers but carried themselves with military precision. Daniel had arranged for an ambulance to transport Delilah, complete with paramedics who were clearly on his payroll, and asked no questions about why we were moving a patient without proper hospital discharge. I rode with her, monitoring her vitals and making sure the transport didn't cause any distress. She remained unconscious throughout, her elegant face peaceful in ways that made my chest ache, with hope that somewhere in her trapped mind she felt the change happening around her. The medical suite prepared for her was better equipped than most hospital rooms, with monitors and equipment that probably cost more than I'd make in 5 years. A hospital bed, but nicer, with controls that would prevent bed sores and make care easier. Windows that looked out over gardens that belonged in paintings, all planned color and strategic beauty. 2 nurses were already present, both older women with the kind of professional competence that came from decades of experience. They looked at me with cautious curiosity, probably wondering who I was and why their employer had brought an outsider into his home. "This is Victoria," Daniel said, his introduction simple but carrying weight. "She's been caring for my mother since the hospital admitted her. She'll be staying here to provide continuity of care, and because my mother trusts her." The statement was generous, giving me status I hadn't earned and authority I wasn't sure I deserved. The other nurses nodded, accepting his word as law, and began the process of settling Delilah into her new environment. I helped transfer her from the ambulance gurney to the proper bed, my hands moving with familiar efficiency. Once Delilah was settled, Daniel gestured for me to follow him. We moved through corridors that managed to feel both luxurious and somehow cold, beauty without warmth. He led me to a bedroom that was larger than my entire apartment, decorated in soft colors that suggested someone had actually thought about creating a comfortable space. "This is your room," Daniel said, his voice carrying none of the warmth it had when he spoke about his mother. "You'll have access to the entire house except for my private office and the security operations room. Meals are provided, and there's a staff kitchen if you want to prepare your own food. You're not a prisoner here, Victoria, but I need you to understand that leaving means ending your involvement with my mother's care." I nodded, trying to process the sudden transformation of my circumstances. Yesterday, I'd been surviving in a studio apartment where the heat barely worked. Today, I was standing in a bedroom that probably cost more to furnish than I'd spent on everything I owned. "There's something else you should know," Daniel continued, his pale eyes holding mine with uncomfortable intensity. "The people who hurt my mother are still out there. They're looking for her, which means they're now looking for anyone connected to her care. By agreeing to come here, you've made yourself a target." The statement should have terrified me, and part of me did feel fear crawling up my spine like cold fingers. But another part, the part that had been numb for too long, felt almost excited by the danger. At least fear was an emotion, better than the emptiness that had been consuming me. "I understand," I said, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. Daniel studied me for another long moment, and I had the uncomfortable feeling he was seeing past whatever facade I'd constructed to the damaged person underneath. Then he nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Welcome to the family, Victoria Morgan. Try not to get killed." The routine I established at the Rossi estate was similar to my hospital care, but elevated by resources I'd never had access to before. Every morning I woke at 6, showered in a bathroom that had heated floors and water pressure that felt like luxury, then made my way to Delilah's room. The other nurses, whose names were Grace and Helen, worked in shifts to ensure 24-hour coverage, but they'd quickly accepted that I was Delilah's primary caregiver. I handled her morning routine with practiced efficiency, washing her body with expensive soaps that smelled like lavender, changing her position to prevent pressure sores, checking the feeding tube that kept her nourished. I talked to her constantly, narrating my actions and sharing observations about her new environment. Your garden is beautiful, Delilah. Someone planted roses in colors I didn't know existed, red and white, and this soft yellow that looks like captured sunlight. I think you'd love them. Maybe when you wake up, we can sit outside and you can tell me all their proper names. Daniel visited every morning without fail, arriving at exactly 7:30 like clockwork. He'd sit beside his mother's bed for 30 minutes, holding her hand and speaking to her in Italian, words I didn't understand, but that carried enough emotion to make my chest tight. Whatever he was saying, it was intimate and raw, the kind of confession people made when they thought no one else could hear. I tried to give them privacy, busying myself with adjusting equipment or reviewing charts, but the room was only so large and some things couldn't be ignored. I watched him transform in those moments, the controlled crime boss becoming just a son who missed his mother. It made him seem more human and somehow more dangerous, because it revealed the depth of feeling he normally kept hidden. After his morning visit, Daniel would find me somewhere in the house to ask about Delilah's condition. Any changes? His question was always the same, asked with carefully controlled hope. Not yet. My answer was always the same, delivered with gentle honesty. But her vital signs remain strong. She's stable, and stable means she's still fighting. One morning, 2 weeks after moving Delilah to the estate, I found Daniel in his mother's room earlier than usual. He stood at the window, his back to me, shoulders tight with tension that suggested he hadn't slept. When he turned, his pale eyes were bloodshot, and his usual careful control seemed frayed around the edges. "We found the people who hurt her," he said, without preamble. "Last night, after weeks of searching, we finally tracked down the men responsible." His voice was flat, emotionless, but his hands were clenched at his sides hard enough that his knuckles had gone white. My stomach tightened with understanding of what that probably meant. I didn't want details, didn't want to know what kind of retribution had been dealt in the darkness while I slept in my comfortable room with heated floors. "Are they?" I paused, searching for words that wouldn't make me complicit in whatever had happened. "Will they be a threat anymore?" Daniel's smile was sharp and cold and entirely without humor. "No. They won't be threatening anyone ever again." The certainty in his voice carried the weight of violence completed and justice served in ways that courts would never recognize. I should have been horrified, should have felt disgust or fear or moral outrage at the casual way he discussed what was almost certainly murder. Instead, I felt something that might have been satisfaction or relief, or the dark acknowledgement that some debts could only be paid in blood. "Does that bother you?" Daniel's pale eyes studied my face, looking for judgment or condemnation. "That my family handles threats permanently rather than through legal channels?" I thought about Delilah lying unconscious in the bed behind us, about the 3 months she'd been alone and suffering, about the kind of justice the legal system would have provided even if her attackers had been caught. Slow trials and plea bargains and sentences that probably would have let them walk free within a few years. "No," I said honestly. "It doesn't bother me as much as it probably should." The confession hung between us like something fragile and dangerous, and I saw Daniel's expression shift as he recalculated whatever assumptions he'd made about me. "Most people would lie," he observed. "Pretend moral superiority they don't actually feel. Say the right things even while secretly being glad that bad people got what they deserved." I'm tired of pretending. The words came out more honest than I intended. I've spent my whole life pretending to be okay when I was drowning, pretending to care about patients who were just job assignments, pretending that I hadn't given up on everything except going through the motions. Your mother was the first person in years who made me feel like I mattered, and she couldn't even talk to me. So no, I'm not going to pretend to be upset that the people who hurt her are gone. Daniel moved closer, and I caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something darker that might have been gunpowder or just my imagination. You're not what I expected, Victoria Morgan. What did you expect? Someone more idealistic, maybe. More innocent. He reached out like he might touch my face, then seemed to think better of it and let his hand drop. Someone who hadn't already been broken by the world. The observation was too accurate, cutting through whatever defenses I'd built to protect myself from being seen too clearly. I wanted to deny it, to claim some dignity or strength I didn't actually possess. Instead, I found myself being honest in ways I hadn't been with anyone in years. I've been broken for a long time, I said quietly. Since my mother left, probably. Or maybe since my father drank himself to death, and I realized I was completely alone. I became a nurse because I thought saving other people might make up for not being able to save him, but it doesn't work that way. You can't fix yourself by fixing strangers. Daniel's expression softened almost imperceptibly. No, you can't. But sometimes you can find purpose in protecting the people who matter. His pale eyes shifted to his mother, lying peaceful and unconscious in the bed that had become her world. She matters to me more than anything, Victoria. More than the business, more than the territory we control, more than the empire my father built and I've been maintaining. If you can help bring her back, there's nothing I wouldn't give you. The intensity of his devotion was almost overwhelming, and I felt something shift in my chest that might have been recognition or kinship, or the dangerous realization that Daniel Rossi understood loss and love in ways most people never did. Before I could respond, Grace appeared in the doorway with the kind of apologetic expression that meant she was interrupting something. Mr. Rossi, there's a situation that requires your attention. Daniel's mask snapped back into place so quickly I might have imagined the vulnerability I'd seen. He nodded once, then turned back to me with an expression that was all business. We'll continue this conversation later. He left with the fluid grace of someone used to handling crises, and I stood alone in Delilah's room trying to understand what had just happened. Something had shifted between Daniel and me. Some recognition that we were both damaged people trying to protect the one person who couldn't protect herself. It should have felt wrong. This growing connection to a man whose world was built on violence and secrets I was only beginning to understand. Instead, it felt like the most honest thing I'd experienced in years. I settled into the chair beside Delilah's bed, taking her hand in mine the way I did every day. Your son loves you so much, I told her, my voice soft in the quiet room. He's been looking for you all this time, and now he's done terrible things to the people who hurt you. I probably should judge him for that, should think he's a monster, but all I can think is that you're lucky to have someone who loves you enough to become a monster on your behalf. Her hand remained still in mine, no flutter of recognition or awareness, but I chose to believe she heard me anyway, chose to believe that somewhere in her trapped mind, she knew she wasn't alone anymore. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm that felt almost normal despite the abnormal circumstances. I cared for Delilah with resources I'd never had, using equipment and medications that probably weren't entirely legal but were undeniably effective. Daniel visited every morning, and our conversations grew longer, shifting from brief medical updates to discussions about everything and nothing. He told me about his mother, about the woman she'd been before the attack. Strong, intelligent, capable of running an empire while maintaining grace and compassion that seemed impossible given the brutality of their world. She taught me that power without mercy makes you a tyrant, Daniel said one morning, his voice reflective. That true strength means knowing when to show kindness and when to deliver justice. She ran the charitable organizations that laundered our money but also genuinely helped people: orphanages, women's shelters, addiction treatment centers. She believed that even people in our world had obligations to make things better where we could. The picture he painted was complex and contradictory: a woman who understood violence but chose compassion whenever possible. It made me love Delilah even more, made me determined to fight for her recovery with everything I had. Also learned about Daniel, about the weight of inheriting an empire at 26 when his father died suddenly, about the enemies who'd seen his youth as weakness and tried to take territory that didn't belong to them, about the hard choices he'd made to maintain control and protect the people dependent on his family's power. "You think I'm a monster?" he said one evening when we were sitting in his mother's room watching the sunset through windows that probably cost more than cars. It wasn't a question, just an observation delivered without judgment. "I think you're someone who does monstrous things for people you love," I corrected. "There's a difference." Daniel's pale eyes studied me in the fading light. "Is there? If the outcome is the same, if people still die, does the motivation really matter?" "Yes," I said with more certainty than I felt. "Because monsters kill for pleasure or power. You kill for protection and justice, even if the justice isn't the kind courts would recognize. That's not the same thing." The conversation should have terrified me, should have sent me running back to my old life of poverty and safety. Instead, I found myself defending a man whose world I barely understood, arguing that morality was more complex than the simple categories I'd been taught. Maybe I was rationalizing, finding excuses to stay in a place where I felt valued and important. Or maybe I was finally being honest about how the world actually worked, acknowledging that sometimes good people had to do bad things, and that didn't necessarily make them monsters. That night, I couldn't sleep. I found myself wandering the estate's corridors, drawn by some instinct I didn't fully understand back to Delilah's room. The night nurse, Helen, looked up from her book with mild surprise. "Everything okay, dear?" "Just couldn't sleep," I said, moving to Delilah's bedside. "Thought I'd sit with her for a while, if that's okay." Helen smiled, the kind of warm expression that came from understanding obsession with patience. "She's lucky to have you." I settled into the chair I'd occupied countless times, taking Delilah's hand in mine. In the dim light, she looked peaceful, almost like she was just sleeping naturally rather than trapped in whatever darkness held her captive. "I'm not going to give up on you," I whispered, my voice barely audible even in the quiet room. "I know the doctors think you'll never wake up, that we're wasting time and resources hoping for a miracle. But I've seen your son's face when he talks to you. I've heard the love in his voice when he speaks Italian and thinks no one understands the emotion behind the words. You have to fight, Delilah. You have to find your way back because he needs you." Her hand remained still in mine, but I swore I felt something. A flutter, barely perceptible, just the slightest pressure against my palm. My heart rate spiked with sudden hope, and I leaned forward, studying her face for any sign of awareness. "Delilah, can you hear me? If you can hear me, squeeze my hand. Please." Nothing. Just the steady beep of monitors and Helen's concerned gaze from across the room. I must have been imagining things, projecting hope onto meaningless reflexes the way I'd done 100 times before. But as I sat there in the darkness, holding the hand of a woman I'd fought for when no one else would, I chose to believe that somewhere in her trapped mind, Delilah was fighting too. The breakthrough came on a Thursday morning exactly 1 month after Delilah had been moved to the estate. I was performing her usual morning care, talking to her about the weather and the birds I'd seen in the garden, when her eyes opened. Not the meaningless eye movements I'd seen before, but genuine, focused awareness that took my breath away. She blinked slowly, her gaze moving around the room with obvious confusion before settling on my face. It took her several attempts to form words, her voice rusty from months of disuse. "Where am I?" The question came out barely above a whisper, but it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. I immediately pressed the call button for the other nurses while keeping my attention on Delilah. "You're safe," I said, my voice shaking with emotion I couldn't control. "You're at your son's estate. You were hurt, and you've been unconscious for 4 months. But you're safe now." Delilah's expression shifted through confusion to gradual understanding. Her hand moved weakly, touching her face like she was confirming she was real. "Daniel," she whispered. "Where is Daniel?" "I'll get him. Just stay calm and don't try to move too much. Your muscles are weak from the extended bed rest, and we need to assess your condition." I ran from the room with Grace and Helen moving past me to take over Delilah's immediate care. I found Daniel in his office, surrounded by papers and looking like he'd been up all night handling business that probably involved violence and territory I was better off not knowing about. "She's awake." The words came out in a rush. "Delilah's awake. She's talking. She asked for you." I watched Daniel's carefully controlled expression shatter. The crime boss who commanded fear and respect disappeared, replaced by a son who'd been waiting 4 months for his mother to open her eyes. He was moving before I finished speaking, running through corridors with graceful desperation. By the time I caught up, he was already at Delilah's bedside, holding her hand and speaking rapid Italian that I couldn't understand, but that clearly carried every emotion he'd been suppressing for months. Delilah responded weakly, her voice growing stronger as she fought through the fog of her extended unconsciousness. I watched from the doorway, giving them privacy for a reunion that was too intimate for strangers to witness. Grace touched my shoulder gently. "You did this," she said quietly. "All those hours talking to her, fighting for her when everyone else had given up. You brought her back." I shook my head, tears running down my face without permission. "She brought herself back. I just made sure she had something to fight for." The next hours passed in controlled chaos as doctors arrived to assess Delilah's condition, as specialists ran tests to determine the extent of her recovery. The verdict was better than anyone expected. Significant cognitive function preserved, motor skills weak but likely to improve with physical therapy, memory mostly intact, though the attack itself remained a blank space she couldn't access. "She's going to be okay," the lead doctor said, directing his words at Daniel. "With proper rehabilitation and continued care, she should regain most of her previous function." It's remarkable, honestly. Most patients with her level of brain injury never wake up, and those who do rarely have this much preservation of self. Daniel's pale eyes found mine across the room, and something passed between us that felt like gratitude and recognition and the beginning of something I was afraid to name. That evening, after the doctors left and Delilah finally slept a natural sleep rather than unconscious oblivion, Daniel found me in the garden. I'd needed air, needed to process the emotional whiplash of the day. "Victoria," he said softly, not wanting to startle me, "I wanted to thank you properly." "You don't need to thank me. I was just doing my job." "It was more than a job, and we both know it." Daniel moved closer, his pale eyes reflecting the garden lights. "You gave my mother something to fight for when she had every reason to give up. You stayed with her when no one else cared. You brought her into our home and into our lives, and now I can't imagine either without you." The confession hung between us like something fragile and dangerous, and I found myself struggling to respond. Daniel had become important to me in ways I didn't fully understand, his presence a constant in days that had been defined by caring for his mother. But the feelings developing between us felt complicated by power dynamics and circumstances that made genuine choice questionable. "I should go back to my old life," I said, not because I believed it, but because I needed to hear his response. "Delilah's awake now, improving every day. She doesn't need me anymore, and I've already stayed longer than we originally agreed." Daniel's expression shifted through emotions too complex to name. Do you want to leave? The question was direct, demanding honesty I wasn't sure I could give. I thought about my studio apartment that I'd stopped paying rent on a month ago, about the hospital job that had probably replaced me by now, about the life I'd been living that had felt more like drowning than actual existence. Then I thought about Delilah improving daily, about the purpose I'd found in caring for her, about the way Daniel looked at me like I was something precious rather than replaceable. No, I admitted quietly. I don't want to leave. But I don't know what staying means. It means becoming part of our world permanently, Daniel said, moving close enough that I could catch the scent of his cologne. It means accepting the darkness that comes with our family, the violence and secrets and moral ambiguity. It means choosing us, choosing me, even knowing what that choice costs. His hand reached up to cup my face with surprising gentleness. I'm asking you to stay, Victoria, not as my mother's nurse, but as someone who belongs here, someone who matters to me in ways I'm still trying to understand. The vulnerability in his admission made my breath catch. This powerful man who commanded an empire and dealt in violence was standing before me asking me to choose him, to choose this complicated, dangerous life over the safety of anonymity and distance. Before I could respond, his mouth was on mine, the kiss desperate and gentle and full of promise. I kissed him back with equal desperation, tasting possibility and danger and the kind of connection I'd been craving without knowing it. When we broke apart, both breathing hard, I found myself smiling despite the complexity of everything we'd have to navigate. I'm staying, I said, the certainty in my voice surprising me. Whatever that means, whatever comes next, I'm choosing this. Choosing you. Daniel's smile was genuine, transforming his face into something almost beautiful. Welcome home, Victoria Morgan. The weeks that followed were full of adjustment and revelation as I transitioned from Delilah's nurse to someone with an actual place in the Rossi family. Delilah's recovery progressed faster than anyone expected, her sharp mind and stubborn determination pushing through limitations that would have defeated lesser people. She insisted on physical therapy sessions that left her exhausted and frustrated, refused to accept help with tasks she could manage independently, and gradually reclaim the strength and dignity that the attack had stolen. I was there through all of it, adjusting my role from caregiver to something more like companion and eventually friend. Delilah was funny and sharp, and surprisingly compassionate given the world she'd lived in for decades. She told me stories about Daniel as a child, about her late husband who'd built the empire their son now controlled, about the strange balance between violence and love that defined their family. You love him, she observed one morning while I was helping her through stretches the physical therapist had prescribed. It wasn't a question, just a statement of fact, delivered without judgment. I did. Deeply and completely, and in ways that terrified me because I'd never let myself be this vulnerable before. Daniel had become essential, his morning visits the highlight of my days, his rare smiles the reward I worked for without realizing it. Is that a problem? I asked carefully, not sure how his mother would respond to the relationship developing between us. Delilah smiled, the expression warm and knowing. Only if you hurt him. My son has been alone for too long, carrying weight that would crush most people. If you can be someone who lightens that load, someone he can trust completely, then you have my blessing. But if you break his heart, I'll be very disappointed. The threat was delivered with grandmotherly warmth, but I heard the steel underneath and remembered that Delilah had run a criminal empire alongside her husband. 6 months after Delilah woke up, the Rossi estate had transformed into something that felt like home. I'd been given a permanent position as Delilah's companion, though the role had expanded to include helping Daniel with various legitimate business ventures and slowly learning the complex web of relationships and obligations that defined his world. I learned which families were allies and which were threats, which police officers were on the payroll and which judges could be trusted to look the other way. I learned the language of violence and territory, of respect and retribution, of power maintained through careful balance between generosity and fear. It should have horrified me, this gradual immersion into criminal enterprise. Instead, I found it oddly fascinating, like learning the rules of a game everyone else had been playing while I watched from the sidelines. Daniel was patient with my education, answering questions honestly, and never treating my ignorance with condescension. He seemed to value my outsider perspective, occasionally asking my opinion on situations that had moral dimensions his world usually ignored. I learned that the Rossi family's criminal activities funded legitimate businesses that employed thousands of people, that their protection rackets actually did protect small businesses from worse predators, that the world was more complicated than simple categories of legal and illegal. I learned that Daniel had inherited not just an empire, but obligations to people who depended on his family's power for survival. Some things I couldn't rationalize or accept. The violence was real and sometimes targeted people who probably didn't deserve death. The drug trade, even at the organizational level Daniel operated, destroyed lives and communities. The corruption of law enforcement meant justice was bought rather than earned. I made my peace with these realities not by accepting them, but by acknowledging my own complicity and choosing to focus on the good I could do within the system. Delilah's charitable foundations became my project. I worked with her to expand services, to ensure that the money being laundered was also genuinely helping people. Orphanages, addiction treatment centers, job training programs for people leaving prison, all funded by criminal enterprise but providing real benefit to communities the legal system had abandoned. It was complicated and morally ambiguous, and probably made me complicit in crimes I didn't want to think about too carefully. But it also helped people who needed help, and I chose to believe that mattered more than the purity of my own conscience. Daniel proposed on a Saturday evening in the garden where he'd first told me he couldn't imagine his life without me. The ring was beautiful, a simple diamond that didn't scream wealth, but suggested careful thought and attention to what I might actually want, rather than what would impress other people. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said, holding the ring but not pushing it onto my finger. "Not because you saved my mother, or because you've become essential to our family, or even because I love you, though I do love you more than I thought I was capable of loving anyone. I'm asking because I want to build a life with you, knowing all the complications that entails, knowing that my world is dangerous and morally gray, and sometimes requires things good people shouldn't have to accept. I'm asking because you see all of that and choose to stay anyway." The proposal was honest and unromantic and perfect in its acknowledgement of reality, rather than fantasy. I looked at the ring, at the man holding it, at the life being offered that was so different from anything I'd imagined for myself. Then I thought about the woman I'd been before Delilah, lost and numb and going through motions that felt meaningless. I thought about the person I'd become, someone with purpose and family and love that was complicated but genuine. "Yes," I said, letting him slide the ring onto my finger. "I'll marry you, Daniel Rossi. I'll build this complicated, beautiful, dangerous life with you, and somehow we'll make it work." His kiss was relief and a promise, and the kind of joy that comes from being seen completely and chosen anyway. Behind us, I heard Delilah's delighted laughter drifting through open windows, and I knew she'd been watching and waiting for this moment with the kind of determined optimism that had brought her back from unconsciousness. The wedding happened 3 months later in the estate's garden with only close family and the most trusted associates present. I wore a simple dress that Delilah helped me choose, And Daniel wore a suit that made him look like the dangerous, beautiful man he was. Delilah walked me down the aisle, her recovered strength allowing her to fulfill a role that meant everything to both of us. We exchanged vows that acknowledged the complexity of our commitment, promising not just love and fidelity, but protection and partnership in a world that didn't always allow for softness. I became Victoria Rossi that evening, taking a name that carried weight and history and expectations I was still learning to navigate. But I also became someone who mattered, someone with purpose beyond just surviving until the next day. The first real test of my new role came 6 months after the wedding when rival families decided to challenge Daniel's control of territory his father had secured decades ago. The violence was calculated and strategic, targeting not the Rossi family directly, but the businesses and people under their protection. Small restaurants that paid for security found themselves vandalized, workers threatened, supply chains disrupted in ways that caused maximum economic damage with minimal legal exposure. Daniel spent long hours in meetings with his advisors, strategizing responses that would restore order without triggering full gang war. I watched him age under the pressure, saw the weight of responsibility pressing down on shoulders that were strong but not infinite. He tried to shield me from the worst of it, but I'd married into this world with open eyes and refused to be protected from realities I'd chosen to accept. One evening, I found him in his office, staring at reports that detailed attacks on people who depended on his family's protection. His expression was carved from stone, but I could see the pain underneath, the burden of knowing that his enemies were hurting innocent people to get to him. "Talk to me," I said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Tell me what you're thinking instead of trying to carry this alone." Daniel's pale eyes lifted to mine, and I saw exhaustion and fury, and something that might have been relief that I was there. "They're killing people to prove they can," he said quietly. "Not our soldiers or associates, just regular people trying to make a living under our protection. A restaurant owner was beaten yesterday because he refused to switch allegiances. His daughter watched it happen." The raw pain in his voice made my chest ache. "What are you going to do?" "What I have to do." Daniel's voice hardened. "I'm going to end this decisively enough that no one else considers challenging us. It's going to be brutal and public, and will probably result in law enforcement attention we'd prefer to avoid. But I can't let this continue. I can't let people suffer because someone decided to test my resolve." I understood what he was saying, understood that violence was coming on a scale I hadn't witnessed before. Everything in me that had been raised to believe in peace and legal justice screamed that there had to be another way. But I'd spent enough time in Daniel's world to know that sometimes strength was the only language people understood, that showing weakness in response to aggression just invited more violence. "Is there anything I can do?" The question surprised him. "You don't have to be involved in this, Victoria." "I know I don't have to be," I said carefully. "But I'm your wife, Daniel. Your partner. If you're carrying this weight, I want to help carry it, even if that just means being present while you make impossible choices." Something shifted in his expression, gratitude mixing with love and the kind of vulnerability he rarely showed anyone. He reached across the desk, taking my hand in his. "Having you here, knowing you see all of this and don't run, that's worth more than you realize." The conflict resolved itself over 3 brutal weeks. Daniel's response was surgical and devastating, targeting the leadership of the challenging families with precision that left no doubt about who had won. I didn't ask for details, didn't want to know specifics about who had died or how, but I saw the aftermath in Daniel's eyes, in the way he held himself like someone carrying the weight of bodies he'd ordered into the ground. I also saw the result in the way violence stopped, in the restaurant owners who could go back to work without fear, in the workers who no longer had to choose between allegiances and safety. The Rossi protection wasn't theoretical anymore. It was proven through action that had restored order at terrible cost. You did what you had to do, I told Daniel one night when we were lying in bed, and he couldn't sleep for the third night running. Those people were safe because of you. I know. His voice was hollow, but knowing it was necessary doesn't make me feel less like a monster. I rolled over to face him, my hand finding his in the darkness. You're not a monster, Daniel. Monsters don't lose sleep over the violence they commit. Monsters don't agonize over whether there was a better way. You're just a man trying to protect people in a world that doesn't always allow for gentle solutions. The reassurance seemed to help. Or maybe just having someone witness his struggle made it bearable. He pulled me against him, holding me with desperate intensity, and eventually his breathing evened into something resembling sleep. I lay awake longer, thinking about the woman I'd become. A year ago, I'd been barely surviving, sharing my last meal with a scared child because some stubborn part of me refused to become as cold as the world around me. Now I was married to a crime boss, defending his violence and helping maintain an empire built on activities I'd been raised to condemn. Delilah's recovery had reached the point where she wanted to reclaim her role in the family business, particularly the charitable foundations that had been her passion before the attack. She approached me one morning with a proposal that would change everything. I want you to take over as director, she said without preamble. The foundations, all of them. You've been helping informally for months, but I want to make it official. You have the compassion and practical sense these organizations need. Plus, you understand the complicated funding sources in ways most people wouldn't accept. The offer was simultaneously exciting and terrifying. Taking official control meant accepting more visibility, more responsibility, more direct involvement in laundering money through legitimate charitable work. It meant crossing a line from passive acceptance to active participation in the machinery of Daniel's empire. I need to think about it, I said honestly. This is a big step, Delilah. I'd be legitimizing criminal enterprise by giving it a virtuous face. Delilah's expression was understanding but firm. You'd also be helping thousands of people who desperately need resources the legal system won't provide. Yes, the money comes from questionable sources. But does a homeless teenager care whether the shelter that saves his life is funded by legitimate donations or organized crime? Does a woman escaping domestic violence ask where the money came from that paid for her safe house? I thought about my own experience with poverty, about the 3 months I'd spent homeless and desperate. I remembered the shelters that had been full, the social services that had been overwhelmed, the gap between the help people needed and the help society was willing to provide. If criminal money could fill that gap, did the moral purity of the funding source really matter more than the lives being saved? I'll do it, I said, making a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff without knowing what waited at the bottom. But I have conditions. Delilah smiled like she'd expected nothing less. Name them. First, the foundations have to do real good, not just exist as money laundering operations. Real programs, real accountability, real impact on the communities we serve. Agreed. Second, I want protection for the people we help. If someone comes to us fleeing violence or seeking recovery, they're off limits for recruitment or retaliation regardless of what family they're connected to. The foundations have to be genuinely neutral territory. Delilah's expression shifted to something like respect. That's asking for a lot. It means forfeiting potential assets and information. I know, but it's non-negotiable. If I'm going to run these organizations, they have to be safe spaces. Otherwise, we're just exploiting vulnerable people in different ways. Delilah was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll discuss it with Daniel and the family council, but I think we can make it work. You're right that truly neutral charitable work provides legitimacy that's worth more than whatever tactical advantage we might gain from compromising it. The foundations became my life's work, expanding from the existing programs into new areas that addressed gaps I'd identified during my own time, surviving on streets and in systems that had failed me. Job training for people leaving prison, transitional housing for families escaping poverty, addiction treatment that actually provided adequate time and resources for recovery, rather than just cycling people through minimal programs. It was rewarding and exhausting and morally complicated because I was always aware that the good we did was funded by activities that harmed other people. Drug money paying for addiction treatment, gambling proceeds funding programs for gambling addicts, violence financing peace. The contradictions were impossible to fully reconcile, so I stopped trying and just focused on the lives being changed. Over time, the foundations gave the Rossi family something they'd never had before: genuine goodwill from communities that had historically viewed organized crime with justified suspicion. People saw the programs helping their neighbors, the resources appearing when legal systems failed, the safety nets that caught people before they fell too far. They didn't ask too many questions about funding sources because they were too grateful for the help. Daniel watched my work with something like awe, seeing his family's empire transform from something purely predatory into something that also provided real value. "You're changing us," he said one evening when we were reviewing foundation reports together. "Making us into something my father never imagined we could be." "I'm not changing you," I corrected. "I'm just highlighting the good that was always possible if someone was willing to push for it." "Your mother knew this. She built the framework. I'm just expanding what she started." The biggest test of my role came when federal investigators started looking into the foundation's funding sources. Someone, probably from a rival family seeking to cause problems, had tipped off authorities about the potential money laundering operation hiding behind charitable work. I spent weeks in meetings with lawyers, preparing for audits that could bring down not just the foundations, but potentially the entire Rossi organization. Daniel wanted to shut everything down immediately, to cut losses before they became catastrophic. But I argued for a different approach. "Let them investigate," I said during a tense family meeting where the men around the table looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "We have nothing to hide in terms of the work we're doing. Yes, some funding comes from questionable sources, but the programs are legitimate, the impact is real, and the accounting is clean. We've been careful about separating operational funds from money that needs laundering. The risk is acceptable compared to the damage we'd do by shutting down programs that thousands of people depend on." Daniel's pale eyes held mine across the table. "You're gambling with your own freedom, Victoria. If they find what they're looking for, you're the director of record. You could go to prison." "Then I guess I better make sure there's nothing to find," I said with more confidence than I felt. The investigation was brutal and thorough. Every transaction examined, every program evaluated, every employee interviewed. I cooperated completely, providing documentation and access that made the investigators' jobs easier while also demonstrating that we had nothing to hide. The foundations passed inspection with minor citations about bookkeeping procedures that were easily corrected. The investigators found exactly what I'd promised they would find: legitimate charitable work funded through complex but legal donation structures. They suspected more, but suspicion wasn't evidence, and evidence was what they needed to proceed. The case closed without charges, and I received a formal letter acknowledging that the foundations were operating within legal parameters. Daniel was waiting when I got home that evening, his expression somewhere between relief and disbelief. "You did it," he said simply. "You beat a federal investigation by just being exactly what you claimed to be." "Not exactly what I claimed," I corrected, settling into his arms with exhaustion that went bone deep. "Exactly what I built. There's a difference." He kissed the top of my head, his voice warm with pride and love. "You're remarkable, Victoria Rossi. I hope you know that." 3 years after sharing my last meal with a scared child in the rain, I stood in the garden of the Rossi estate and watched Delilah play with her grandson. Daniel and I had welcomed a son 6 months earlier, naming him after Daniel's father in a tradition that carried weight in their world. The baby represented hope and continuation, proof that the family would endure beyond the violence and territory disputes that defined so much of their history. Delilah had recovered almost completely from her brain injury, occasional memory issues the only lasting effect of 4 months in a coma. She'd officially retired from active involvement in the family business, but remained an advisor whose wisdom Daniel sought regularly. Watching her with her grandson, I saw the woman she must have been before the attack. Strong, loving, fiercely protective of family while maintaining the grace and compassion that made her beloved even in a world that didn't always reward kindness. "You changed everything," Daniel said, coming to stand beside me. His arm wrapped around my waist, pulling me against him in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "You saved my mother when everyone else had given up. You gave me a family and a future I never thought I could have. You made our world better just by choosing to be part of it." I leaned into his embrace, watching our son laugh at something his grandmother was doing. "I didn't change everything," I said softly. "I just chose to see people instead of circumstances, to fight for what mattered even when the smart thing would have been to walk away." The choice had cost me whatever illusions I'd had about moral purity and simple answers. I'd become complicit in a criminal enterprise, helping legitimize activities I couldn't fully defend. I'd married a man who ordered deaths and controlled territory through violence I tried not to think about too carefully. But I'd also found purpose and family and love that was complicated and genuine. I'd helped thousands of people through the foundations, creating safety nets that caught people before they fell as far as I once had. I'd watched Delilah recover against impossible odds, seen her reclaim her life and her role in a family that needed her wisdom. I'd given Daniel something he'd never had before, a partner who saw all his darkness and chose to love him anyway. The rain started falling softly, gentle drops that reminded me of that night in the alley when everything changed. Delilah laughed and gathered up the baby, hurrying toward the house. Daniel and I stayed in the garden, letting the rain fall on our faces, like a baptism or a blessing. "Some girls dream of being rescued by princes," I said, thinking about the woman I'd been and the woman I'd become. I got rescued by sharing soup with a child and then having his father change my life forever. Daniel pulled me closer, his lips finding mine in a kiss that tasted like rain and promise, and the complicated, beautiful life we'd built together. "Best rescue story I've ever heard," he murmured against my mouth. The city glittered in the distance beyond the estate's walls, full of people struggling and surviving and, occasionally, finding moments of grace in unexpected places. Somewhere out there, another version of me was probably sharing her last meal with a stranger, choosing kindness over survival, refusing to let the world make her as cold as circumstances suggested she should be. I hoped she found what I found: hope and purpose, and the understanding that sometimes the most important choice you make is deciding what kind of person you want to be when everything else has been stripped away. The rain fell harder, washing the world clean, and I let myself believe that grace was possible even in the darkest places, that love could grow in soil that seemed too contaminated to nurture anything good. That transformation was always available to people brave enough to choose it. Daniel and I walked back to the house together, our hands intertwined, our son waiting inside with his grandmother who'd come back from death because someone refused to give up on her. It was complicated and morally ambiguous and more beautiful than anything I'd imagined for myself. It was family, earned through choice rather than blood, built on foundations that were simultaneously criminal and charitable, violent and loving, dark and light all at once. It was home, and I'd spent my last dollar to help a scared child find his way back to it, never knowing that in saving him, I'd somehow saved myself.